I'm going to review today Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass by Frederick Douglass. Now, just a quick warning slash programming note. There is construction going on, and I think the apartment directly above me, it seems to have temporarily paused, but they may start hammering or drilling again at any moment. If it's minor noise, I might try and carry on. If it gets too loud, I might just stop the video and then start filming later. I've learned how to do some basic editing since I first started this channel, so I should be able to put those two different segments of videos together. And apologies in advance for any background noise. This is just what it's like to live in Vietnam. For anyone new to the channel, I'm working in Vietnam as an English teacher. And drilling in the apartments above you is just so common in Ho Chi Minh City. It just happens to everybody at some time or another, and this is my day. And yeah, this is really the only time I have today to try and film this video, so I'm gonna see if I can make it. Anyways, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. So Frederick Douglass is somebody I've been meaning to read up on for years, and I basically only know the Wikipedia version of his life. But even that is quite fascinating. If you're like me as an American, you vaguely know who he is, but maybe you don't know the details. I've been in conversation this week with a couple people who didn't even know who he was, although granted those weren't Americans, one was from New Zealand. But Frederick Douglass was born as a slave. He escaped from slavery, and then he started attending abolitionist meetings, and he became a prominent speaker on the abolitionist circuit, giving speeches everywhere. He went to Europe, to England and Ireland, where he was a huge celebrity, gave lots of speeches to packed houses with standing room only. He was back in the U.S. In the 1850s when things were getting very hot. He had some sort of association with John Brown. They at least met. I think Frederick Douglass knew about Harper's Ferry, although it's a little bit murky. Frederick Douglass ultimately decided he wanted nothing to do with it. Presumably, he could tell it was a bad plan before it even went off. But then after Harper's Ferry happened, there was a huge backlash against abolitionists and Frederick Douglass. So he had to flee to Canada to avoid the possible legal trouble from it. But then eventually came back to the United States, was active during the Civil War. He met with Lincoln. He was a recruiter for the Union Army. He was active during the Reconstruction era. He met with President Grant. He was involved in a number of initiatives and laws and advocating for this and that. So had a career right up until I think he died in the mid-1880s as somebody who was very active in, I guess, what we would not now call civil rights politics, but advocacy for first abolition and then for the post-Civil War era. So it's a fascinating life, and I've been meaning to read up on it for some time now and just have never gotten around to it. A couple of years ago, Steve Donahue did a video recommending Frederick Douglass's autobiography. I'll link to it in the description down below. It's worth checking out. Steve Donahue is much more eloquent and succinct and well-spoken than I am, not to mention more knowledgeable. So check out Steve's video maybe before you watch the rest of mine. But when I found out that Frederick Douglass had an autobiography published, I thought, I'd like to read that someday. Now, as it happens, actually, it turns out Frederick Douglass had published 3 autobiographies during his lifetime. This slender volume I'm holding here is the first one, published in 1845. It describes his life as a slave and how he escaped from slavery. But the details at the end are sparse because he didn't want to implicate or endanger anyone or compromise the runnings of the Underground Railroad. So apparently there was a expanded autobiography, which, My Bondage and My Freedom, which was published in 1855. And then near the end of his life, he published a third autobiography, which I think was published in the 1880s, called Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. Now, I've not read any of those other 2. This is the only one I've read at the moment. I'd be very curious to read that third autobiography, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, because that would encompass his political career, his meetings with Lincoln, his meetings with Grant, his advocacy work, the whole Harper's Ferry fiasco. But that's not what this is. This is his first and shortest autobiography, published in 1845, which basically describes his life as a slave. However, even though this is the shortest one, this is also the most famous one, which is no doubt why I've stumbled upon this one in bookstores. I got this in a bookstore in Vietnam, Collins Classic. So when this was first published in 1845, it was a huge sensation and was one of those books that galvanized the abolitionist movement in the North and I think was famous in England. So this is the book that made him famous. And so that's why this is the book that is still most widely available in bookstores nowadays, even though it's the most incomplete of his autobiographies. This is the one that would make the list of, great books in the canon of Western literature. This is the really famous one. This is, I read it just because I stumbled across it in the bookstores here in Vietnam. This is the one I had access to. It is, as you can see here, a very slender volume. And in fact, it's even smaller than it looks because these last few pages here are just a glossary of words and phrases. Not that you would need that. Collins Classics, for whatever reason, has a glossary of words and phrases of words that are likely to pop up in classic books. It's not even a glossary for this particular book. So this particular book clocks in at 122 pages. It's if you go to the audiobook on YouTube, it's only something like 4 hours long. I took a couple weeks to read it, and then sometime longer to get this review together. But you could probably read it in an afternoon or a couple days at most. It's written in a somewhat older style, as you would expect from a book written in 1845. But you get used to it quickly, and it's incredibly readable. Steve Donahue, in his review of this book, says that, I forget his exact words, but he says something like, once you get used to the prose, you find that there's a very brilliant mind at work here in kind of the turn of phrase. It took me a while to appreciate that. I think it was my second reading that I started to appreciate just how well it was written and what a way Frederick Douglass has with words. But yeah, it's definitely in there. So this is a slave narrative. It describes what it was like to be a slave in Frederick Douglass's time. There are some interesting sociological observations. For example, how proud the slaves were to be chosen to get sent to an errand to the big house. Frederick Douglass lived on this massive plantation where there were many different farms all connected to this big house. And he at one point mentions that to get chosen to be an errand to the big house was like getting elected to the House of Congress. And he says that there was as much politicking around getting chosen to go to the big house as there might be for somebody who gets for an elected representative or a hopeful candidate to get to the House of Representatives. It talks about how slaves will frequently fight other slaves about who had the better master. Like when two groups of slaves meet each other, they argue about whose master is smarter or richer, and he says it almost always came to physical fighting. So those types of details are not, they don't really serve the main theme of the narrative. The main theme of the narrative, of course, is slavery is awful and dehumanizing and needs to be abolished. And again, this was written in 1845 when slavery was still flourishing in America. But they're interesting little sociological details. But that's not the main thrust. The main thrust is to just describe what an awful institution slavery is. It has, my edition here has a little life and times summary of Frederick Douglass written by Collins Classic. But then there's also two prefaces from the original 1845 version. First one is from William Lloyd Garrison, which is a name I actually recognize from my high school American history classes. Sorry, I don't know why I can't talk today. Mornings, huh? Yeah, a name I recognize from my high school American history classes. And then the second one is a second preface from Wendell Phillips, which is a name I did not recognize. I had to look that up on Wikipedia. But according to Wikipedia, he was also a famous abolitionist at the time. Yeah, just out of curiosity, I'd be curious to see what other people's mileage on this is. Do you recognize these names? Did you encounter them in history classes, etc.? So the prefaces are interesting. William Lloyd Garrison is a very powerful writer, and you know his whole career was as a dedicated abolitionist. So you would expect him to come out strongly against slavery, and he does. At the same time, I found it, I don't know, sometimes I will fall into this mindset where you think to yourself, well, of course, nowadays we know slavery is bad. But, you know, back then, it was, you know, the founding fathers had slaves, George Washington had slaves, Thomas Jefferson had slaves. People didn't realize it was bad like we do now. But you read William Lloyd Garrison's introduction to this, and he comes out very strong language against slavery. And it's a reminder that you cannot use that excuse about people didn't know better in the past. People had very strong opinions about it in the past. Although I wonder, maybe somebody who knows more about American history than me could clarify this. William Lloyd Garrison was writing this in 1845. Thomas Jefferson and George Washington were a couple generations earlier. One generation earlier, I don't know. So Was the anti-slavery movement as strong in Thomas Jefferson's day? Uh, I don't really know. But the other interesting thing about this, reading William Lloyd Garrison's introduction, you get the feeling of somebody who has just been in the trenches of this argument for so long and kind of has a tired aspect of it. Like, I know that there are some people who this is not going to convince. I know that there are some people who are just going to say this is an exaggeration and lies. Even though all of this stuff is well documented and you can see it in the newspapers every day, there are just some people you can't convince. And of course, you read that and you think of the nowadays, right? And you can pick your issue, and maybe you can pick which side of the issue you are on, but it does feel nowadays like you can marshal all the facts and anecdotes and documentation that you want, and there are just people who refuse to be convinced on the issue. I mean, this is something I've been thinking a lot about, especially recently, because you can't help but think about it nowadays. The whole dynamic of tribalism and how people just do not react to rational arguments or rational facts, but just have this tribal identity that they base their politics around their group identity and just cannot be swayed by it. And it sounds like this was what was happening back in the 1840s, even in the North. William Lloyd Garrison talks about his frustration with Northerners who just don't believe that slavery could be as bad in the South as the abolitionists are making it out to be. And yes, similar sentiments from Wendell Phillips. Now, a point that's made by both Wendell Phillips and William Lloyd Garrison is Frederick Douglass did not actually have the worst life as a slave in comparison to the true horrors that slavery could be. He lived in Maryland, which was, one of those border states. They say in Georgia and Missouri, it's much worse. In Maryland, it's comparatively mild. But then they go on to say, but take note, read this. It's read what happened to Frederick Douglass. It is bad enough what he experienced. And if it's that bad in a comparatively mild state like Maryland, then just imagine how much worse it is in the Deep South. There is also an assumption that slavery degrades people. So now William Lloyd Garrison makes the point that this is not a racial thing. And he gives an example of a white man who was captured, I don't know, in the Barbary States or something like that, forced into slavery. And when he was eventually rescued, his mind had just degenerated to a brute animal, just because he was just worked all day, only had time to work and sleep, never had time to read or develop his mind. And there seems to be an assumption that that's what slavery does to people. I wonder. Is that true? It's impossible to run the experiment now because all of this society, the slave society, is now long gone, at least from the Americas. But yeah, the assumption is that Frederick Douglass, because of his unique circumstances, living in Maryland, he was working as a house servant up in Baltimore for some time, where he learned to read and write, largely self-taught, as he describes in this book. So somebody like that could, once he escaped from slavery, could go on to be a very eloquent speaker and writer. So I think the assumption is, because of his unique circumstances, he was able to write and speak so eloquently on slavery, whereas somebody who had just been in the Deep South and been brutalized all their life might not have the capacity for it. I think that's the assumption being made in the introduction here. By the way, the publisher's introduction, Colin's Classic, makes the point that actually in the 1840s and 50s, slave narratives were a popular genre. We only remember the most famous ones now. Uncle Tom's Cabin, 12 Years a Slave, and of course Frederick Douglass. But it says there was a lot of them. It says, quoting from the publisher's introduction, many of these slave narratives were also tied in to the American Romantic movement, an audience's demand for sensationalist stories. So their prevalence didn't always have humanitarian or politically minded roots. While Uncle Tom's Cabin continued to be popular well into the 20th century, important movements to widen and reinterpret the canon of African American literature have resulted in the first-hand accounts of slavery coming to the forefront. And then, actually, that wasn't the exact quote I was looking for. Somewhere else here, it makes the point that a lot of these slave narratives were ghostwritten, possibly because the escaped slaves didn't have the literary skills to do it. But Frederick Douglass, by the time this narrative came out, had already established himself as a well-known orator, giving speeches in abolitionist circles. And he had developed a distinctive style that people recognized. So when his autobiography came out, they recognized his distinctive style here, and there was no doubt that this had been written by himself. And yeah, just as a quick side note, autobiographies, if they're authentic autobiographies written by the real person and not ghostwritten, I find them absolutely fascinating. Just in the abstract, maybe, that we are separated by a gulf of 160 years between us and the mind of Frederick Douglass, and yet we can read his actual memories from his actual brain of the life he actually experienced. It's just a wonderful thing in autobiography, even though this one is a little bit depressing. But just that connection to that historic mind and his actual reminiscences about his real life. Okay, sorry, I was making the point that his life as a slave was comparatively mild, but the key word here is comparatively, because there is some stuff in here that just is tough. It makes you feel depressed or makes you feel real angry. And it's right from the beginning. He talks about how he never knew his mother. He said he was separated from his mother before he was a year old. He says, I don't know why the slave owners do this. It just seems to be, he says this was a custom. For what this separation is done, I do not know, unless it be to hinder the development of the child's affection towards its mother, and to blunt and destroy the natural affection of the mother for the child. This is the inevitable result. I never saw my mother, to know her as such, more than 4 or 5 times in my life, and each of these times was very short in duration, and at night. She was hired by a Mr. Stewart, who lived about 12 miles from my home. She made her journeys to see me in the night, traveling the whole distance on foot after the performance of her day's work. She was a field hand and a whipping is the penalty of not being in the field at sunrise. Skipping down a little bit, I do not recollect of ever seeing my mother by the light of day. She was with me in the night. She would lie down with me and go to sleep, but long before I waked, she was gone. Very little communication ever took place between us. Death soon ended what little we could have while she lived. His mother died when he was still a young child. Sorry, I mean, doesn't that just break your heart? The mother can't even see her own child, but that maternal instinct is so strong that she walks 12 miles in the night just to sleep next to him. Sorry. That's the kind of depressing nature that this book can have. Depressing and at times horrifying. He describes how an aunt of his was whipped by the master. Let's see. Yeah. And this part is maybe worth reading as well. Pardon me for the long quotation. Master was not a humane slaveholder. It required extraordinary barbarity on the part of an overseer to affect him. He was a cruel man, hardened by a long life of slaveholding. He would at times seem to take great pleasure in whipping a slave. I have often been awakened at the dawn of day by the most heart-rending shrieks of an own aunt of mine, whom he used to tie up to a joist and whip upon her naked back till she was literally covered with blood. No words, no tears, no prayers from his gory victim seemed to move his iron heart from its bloody purpose. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped, and where the blood ran fastest, there he whipped longest. He would whip her to make her scream, and whip her to make her hush, and not until overcome by fatigue would he cease to swing the blood-clotted cowskin. I remember the first time I ever witnessed this horrible exhibition. I was quite a child, but I well remember it. I shall never forget it, whilst I remember anything. It was the first of a long series of such outrages of which I was doomed to be a witness and a participant. It struck me with awful force. It was the blood-stained gate, the entrance to the hell of slavery, through which I was about to pass. It was a most terrible spectacle. I wish I could commit to paper the feeling with which I beheld it. This occurrence took place very soon after I went to live with my old master, and under the following circumstances. Aunt Hester went out one night, where or for what for I do not know, and happened to be absent when my master desired her presence. He had ordered her not to go out evenings, and warned her that she must never let him catch her in company with a young man who was paying attention to her, belonging to Colonel Lloyd. The young man's name was Ned Roberts, generally called Lloyd's Ned. Why master was so careful of her may be safely left to conjecture. She was a woman of noble form and of graceful proportions, having very few equals and fewer superiors in personal appearance among the colored or white women of our neighborhood. Aunt Hester had not only disobeyed his orders in going out, but had been found in company with Lloyd's Ned, which circumstances I found, from what he said while whipping her, was the chief offense. Had he been a man of pure morals himself, he might have been thought interested in protecting the innocence of my aunt. But those who knew him will not suspect him of any such virtue. Before he commenced whipping Aunt Hester, he took her into the kitchen and stripped her from neck to waist, leaving her neck, shoulders, and back entirely naked. He then told her to cross her hands, calling her at the same time a damned bitch. After crossing her hands, he tied them with a strong rope and led her to a stool under a large hook in the joist, put in for the purpose. He made her get upon the stool and tied her hands to the hook. She now stood fair for his infernal purpose. Her arms were stretched up at full length, so that she stood upon the ends of her toes. Then he said to her, "Now, you damned bitch, I'll learn you how to disobey my orders." And after rolling up his sleeves, he commenced to lay on the heavy cowskin, and soon the warm, red blood, amid heart-rending shrieks from her and horrid oaths from him, came dripping to the floor. I was so terrified and horror-stricken at the sight that I hid myself in a closet and dared not venture out till long after the bloody transaction was over. I expected it would be my turn next. And then he ends that section with, I had therefore been until now out of the way of the bloody scenes that often occurred on the plantation. So that's chapter 1. And there are just so many scenes like that throughout the book. And as is evident from that scene, Frederick Douglass describes not only what happened to him as a slave, but also all the things that he observed on the plantation, all the atrocities. So it can be a tough book to read emotionally. And I think that the natural human reaction to that is to get depressed and also to feel outrage about it. And I certainly felt my share of outrage while reading this book. It's strange, we humans and our emotions, isn't it? I was reading last year a book on evolutionary psychology. So I've been in this habit of trying to think about things from what evolutionary benefit it brings us. I mean, what benefit does it do for us to get angry about it? If it was going on nowadays, the anger would be beneficial because maybe it would motivate people to try to stop the injustice. But when you're reading about a historical justice, I mean, you get so angry about it, but what's the point? That master has been dead for a couple hundred years. There's that Aunt Hester has been dead. There's no way you could ever change what happened, and the people involved have gone out of the realm of consciousness, so they don't care, right? And Hester no longer cares. She's dead and can't feel anything and can't appreciate anyone trying to remedy the injustice anyway. So what good does it do to get mad about it? But we do, don't we? You read that and you just get so angry, and yeah, it's like that throughout the book as you read it. However, as perhaps I don't know if you noticed during that section I was reading, very well written. I mean, put away the horror of the scene he's describing. slightly older prose, but very well written. And again, that carries throughout the whole book as well. One thing this book never is it's never boring. I was reading a quotation earlier from the Collins Classic, where it says that the prevalence of slave memoirs in the 1840s didn't always have humanitarian or politically minded roots. There was a demand for sensationalist stories. So, I don't know, exploitation, I guess we would call it nowadays. Which is disgusting, but you can kind of see it. There's, as terrible as it is, there is this fascination with the horror of it. So, you're reading this, and I would be quite often reading this during my lunch break or something like that. And Frederick Douglass would be right in the middle of describing some sort of atrocity or brutality he had witnessed. And you think, well, I've got to keep reading, right? I've got to find out what happens or exactly how horrible this ended up being. There is that fascination as you read it. So it does grip you. Depressing at times, enraging at times, but never boring. Now, I've already gone off on a few tangents already, talking about tribalism, evolutionary psychology, how angry this book makes you. And there are so many tangents that it's tempting to go off on now. I'm aware that I've already been rambling for 36 minutes already, and I don't know if you can hear this. They've started drilling again. I'm going to try and talk for a little bit longer. I mean, one of the things reading this, and again, coming off of that introduction with William Lloyd Garrison and Wendell Phillips, where it was evident they were right in the heart of this bitter back and forth about the morality of slavery that was going on in America in the 1840s. But then reading Frederick Douglass's narrative, you just think, okay, there can't have been any moral ambiguity about this. The people who owned slaves and treated them like that had to know it was bad. I mean, they had to know. All of this debate we had about whether slavery was an acceptable economic or lifestyle. All those debates we had in the early part of this country, the people on that other half of that, you can't read this and think, well, the people at that time, they didn't know any better. Doing that kind of thing to another human being, you just have to know that that's not right, and that keeping slaves is not right. It made me think, actually, many of the founding fathers were slaveholders. And this is something that we kind of wash over, okay, George Washington had slaves, Thomas Jefferson had slaves, but it was a different time. People didn't know that slavery was bad then. But, reading this book, you think, well, that they had to have known, right? William Lloyd Garrison makes an interesting point here. He says, he's talking about the slaveholder. He says, the slaveholder is a felon of the highest grade. He is a man-stealer. It is of no importance what you put in the other scale. So, I've been an admirer of Thomas Jefferson to the limited extent I know much about him, and have been inclined to overlook the fact that he was a slaveholder. But, maybe William Lloyd Garrison has a point here. It is of no importance what you put in the other scale. So, you can't say, okay, well, Thomas Jefferson had slaves, but he also had some really good ideas about liberty and equality and stuff like that. Now, it is of no importance what you put in the other scale. He is a felon of the highest grade. He is a man-stealer. George Washington, it is of no importance what you put in the other scale. After reading this book, it's hard to come away with the feeling that it is of no importance what you put in the other scale after reading about what went on in these plantations. And I shouldn't exaggerate my naivete. Sorry, I can't talk this morning. I learned about slavery in history class at school, just like everybody else did. But like a lot of things, it sort of settles into the back of your mind, and you kind of forget just how outrageous it is as you go about your day-to-day life. But then you read this, and then it all comes back to you. The other thing that really makes you think a lot in this book, I mean, there's a lot of things that make you think a lot in this book. I could talk for hours about all the little thoughts you could have while reading a book like this about human nature and human psychology and human evolution and all this stuff. But a point Frederick Douglass harps on repeatedly is how the worst slaveholders were the most religious slaveholders. And it reminds me of Christopher Hitchens. Maybe those of you who were on YouTube a lot around the 2008 or 2010 will remember Christopher Hitchens was frequently all over YouTube doing these debates about how religion makes everything worse. And if you've seen some of these debates, you'll know that his opponents would frequently make the point to him. They say, okay, but be honest, Christopher. You're in an inner city at night. There's a gang of young men walking towards you. You'd feel better if they were Christians, right? The fact that people are Christians makes them behave better. And Christopher Hitchens, I don't know if this was, I mean, we can debate whether this was dishonest of him or not, but he would always say, nope. It makes them behave worse. There's no circumstances where somebody's morality is improved by their being a Christian. I'm a skeptic myself. I had trouble buying that at times. I thought, well, But anyway, sorry, the point being, Frederick Douglass is making this point repeatedly in this book, that the Christianity made them behave worse. He talks about how his master got religion, and the slaves thought maybe that he would become a better master, having embraced the I think it was a Methodist renewal. But then his master actually became more cruel. And how the slaveholders used the Bible verses to justify their cruelty. There was a verse here. What was it? He that knoweth his master's will and doeth it not shall be beaten with many stripes, or something like that. Which I didn't recognize that verse, even though I've read the Bible and consider myself familiar with it. So I put it into Google, and it sure enough, it's from the Gospel of Luke. It was part of a parable that Jesus was telling, and I think in context seems to me to mean to be taken metaphorically. But it is in the Bible. So if you're the kind of slaveholder who wants to latch onto that, you can latch onto those type of things. You can take those verses. He that knoweth his master's will and doeth it not shall be beaten with many stripes. Was something that his master was saying, where he was beating these poor slave girls. And of course, the curse of Ham gets referenced in here. also from the Bible. That's supposedly the biblical justification for slavery, is that Noah cursed his son Ham and said the descendants of Ham will be slaves to the descendants of, I forget the name of his other son. And that has also been used as a justification for slavery. Frederick Douglass is cynical about that explanation, because Frederick Douglass himself was half white. Probably his father was his master, although nobody ever told him for certain. So he said, if the curse of Ham is going to be used as a justification for keeping people in bondage, this is going to get a little bit ridiculous, because we're going to have so many people in slavery who are actually have more white blood in them than black. Sorry, that's another digression. The point being, something he harps on again and again and again is the religious hypocrisy of the slaveholders. He talks about what they did to his grandmother, how his grandmother had served them so faithfully for her whole life, and then when she got too old to serve them, they just sent her out in the woods to die. And he said, how could a Christian do these things? These men who go to church every Sunday, have these prayer meetings, pray so piously, and then don't see any contradiction between that religion and what they're doing. And again, this is something that would make you think in any number of directions, because I think religious hypocrisy is an issue nowadays as well. And you can take the religious rights and some, I don't want to say all of them, but definitely some of them are endorsing very cruel policies under the guise of religion. This is something I feel like I could ramble on for a long time, talking about maybe how religious beliefs aren't really religious beliefs, they're tribal identities. So people just take their cues of morality from the people around them. And if all the other Christians around you are slaveholders, then you don't seem to think any contradiction between Christianity and slaveholding. I guess you could, if you're Christopher Hitchens, you would make the point about how religion never helps anything. In fact, it makes people even more cruel. A point, though, that you would have to keep in mind with all of this is Frederick Douglass himself later became a preacher after he escaped from slavery. And Frederick Douglass addresses this in the appendix, because he is aware that throughout this whole narrative, he's been very hard on Christianity. So he says in the appendix to this, he says, I find, since reading over the foregoing narrative, that I have in several instances spoken in such a tone and manner respecting religion as may possibly lead those unacquainted with my religious views to suppose me an opponent of all religion. Well, yeah, Frederick, you do give that impression, yes. And then he says, to remove the liability of such misapprehension, I deem it proper to append the following brief explanation. What I have said respecting and against religion, I mean strictly to apply to the slave-holding religion of this land, and with no possible reference to Christianity proper. For between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference, so wide to receive the one as good, pure, and holy, is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be the friend of one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. And he actually goes on for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more pages expanding on that theme. But you get the idea. He's aware that he's given a very negative view of Christianity all throughout the book, so he spends 5 pages seeking to redress it. Now, possibly this is a no true Scotsman fallacy. I don't know. We could argue about that. But it did strike me that in order to be upset that the slaveholders are cloaking their cruelty under the morality of religion, we have to recognize that there's an hypocrisy there. We have to recognize that our expectations of Christianity is that it would make people more good, more loving, more kind people. And so we are angry at what we see as the incongruity there. In other words, if we didn't have the expectation that Christianity was supposed to make people better, we would have no cause to be angry about when we see Christianity being used in this way. Is something I tried to remind myself, although I'm a skeptic myself, so I'm maybe more sympathetic to Christopher Hitchens' views. Well, I'm an agnostic, so I go back and forth depending on what day you catch me. So yeah, I don't know. You could. Frederick Douglass wants to be very careful. He's only against religion of the slaveholders as it's used, the hypocrisy of it. We could argue whether or not. Well, we could argue whether or not that is inherent to Christianity, or if all religious beliefs are just a facade for some sort of tribal identity. We could argue about that, but that would be a long discussion. And how long is this video now? I've already been rambling on for 52 minutes. I think I'll wrap things up here. There is, I mean, as I said, this is a short book. You could read it in an afternoon or a couple afternoons. There is so much in here to think about regarding not only the historical injustice, which was slavery, not only how we ever justified that as a country, but also just all these little facets of human nature, and why can humans be so cruel to each other, and what part religion plays in this, and all these different things which you will think about while you're reading this book. But I won't ramble on about that. You can read the book and draw your own conclusions and think about these things on your own. To conclude, it's a strong recommend. Steve Donahue said in his video that every American should read this book. And yeah, every American should read this book. It's a short little book. It's not difficult to read. I think this should be mandatory reading in schools. I mean, I do think American high schools, on the whole, do a fairly good job of covering slavery and the barbarity associated with it. Certainly, that was my high school education. We didn't read this book, but we read other books. But this book is short. You need a short book if you're going to assign it in high schools. It's authentic. It's not like a fictionalized reconstruction. It's by an eyewitness to them, who has the bonus of being a very important person in American history. Seems to tick all the boxes to me of something that should be assigned reading in school. So, but yeah, but schools, huh? What are you gonna do? So if you didn't read this book in school, and I think most people haven't, track it down. It is well worth reading. Yeah.